Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to try to unpack the world of Mehdi Hasan.
Sounds like a challenge. He's a pretty prominent figure, journalist, political commentator, got his own show, Deconstructed.
Right. Used to be with MSNBC, actually.
Yeah.
So we've got quite a bit of material to go through.
Interviews, articles, even some excerpts from his book, Win Every Argument.
Yeah. Our goal today is to really try to understand Hasan's views on some pretty important topics.
Like what?
Well, Western media's portrayal of Arabs and Muslims, the state of free speech, is it really free? And that whole ever-evolving narrative surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Okay. Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
We do. So Mehdi Hasan, born in Swindon, UK. Interesting, right? Immigrant parents from India.
Yeah, pretty traditional upbringing, it sounds like. I mean, his dad was an engineer, his mom a doctor.
You'd think they'd want him to follow in their footsteps.
Right, but instead he goes and chooses journalism.
Yeah. I mean, he even jokes that his mom was a little disappointed by that decision.
I can imagine. So, how do you think growing up as a minority in Swindon shaped his perspective?
Oh, I think it definitely played a role. Remember that story about the hot dog?
Yeah, where his mom told him not to eat pork and he accidentally grabbed a hot dog instead of a hamburger.
Exactly.
Funny story, but it also highlights a deeper point, doesn't it?
Yeah, about cultural differences, misunderstandings.
And it wasn't always just funny anecdotes. His dad used to write letters to the editor, express his opinions, and he'd get hate mail for it.
Really?
Like, we're talking literal dog litter sent to their house. This was back in the 60s and 70s in the UK.
Wow. That's intense. It really speaks to the kind of racism that was prevalent back then.
Definitely. And you can see how those experiences might have influenced Hasan's decision to challenge narratives, to speak truth to power.
Absolutely. So, speaking of challenging narratives, the guy's known for his debating skills, right? Razor sharp.
Oh, yeah. Incredibly meticulous in his preparation. Has these pre-debate rituals, like he won't eat beforehand to stay mentally sharp.
Interesting tactic.
And he really dives deep into his research, aims to know his opponent's argument better than they do.
Wow. So he's always a few steps ahead.
Seems like it. And get this, he doesn't share his remarks with anyone beforehand.
Really? But in his book, Win Every Argument, he tells people to practice extensively.
I know, right? It's like he saves all his intellectual firepower for the main event.
Remember that interview with Vivek Ramaswamy?
Oh, yeah, the one where he caught him in that factual error about the scholarship.
Exactly. Classic Hasan, meticulous research, dismantling his opponent's arguments.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back. And it's not always about winning the argument. Some of those interviews, they can get really intense.
Like that one with Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv.
Oh, yeah. Alleged ties to the Ukrainian mafia. The tension was palpable.
Klitschko even asked Hasan to slow down because his English wasn't strong enough to keep up with his rapid-fire questions.
Right. But Hasan just kept pushing, kept asking the tough questions.
And then Klitschko confronted him after the interview ended. Talk about awkward.
It really highlights the risks he takes when challenging powerful figures.
Speaking of challenging powerful figures, that interview with Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, that was huge.
Oh, yeah. Went viral. Exposed some serious inconsistencies in Prince's story. Even led to a congressional referral for perjury.
That's impactful journalism. It really shows how Hasan's not afraid to hold people accountable, no matter who they are.
No matter how powerful.
Right. And it's not just about individual interviews,
What do you mean?
This deep dive is about understanding his broader perspective.
Okay.
Like his take on the Western media's portrayal of Arabs and Muslims, a topic that's obviously very personal to him.
Yeah, given his own experiences with prejudice and misrepresentation.
Right. You can really see how his personal experiences connect to his criticisms of media bias.
Especially during the Ukraine war. The double standards were glaring.
Oh, absolutely. The way Ukrainian refugees were treated compared to Syrian refugees, it was shocking. News reports were full of descriptions like European people with blue eyes.
Dehumanizing.
Completely. And then there was all the talk about how civilized Ukrainian cities are compared to, say, Iraq.
Right, as if somehow Arab cities are inherently less civilized.
Yeah, that's blatant bias. And it ties into Hasan's broader point about the dehumanization of refugees from the Middle East and North Africa.
And let's not forget the 2022 World Cup in Qatar.
Oh, yeah, that was another media frenzy. Suddenly, everyone was an expert on human rights in Qatar.
Right, but those same standards were rarely applied to other countries with similar or worse records.
Exactly. It's like Qatar was being singled out.
Which is interesting because Hasan actually attended the World Cup.
He did. And he spoke about the positive aspects, too. The safety, the accessibility, the overall atmosphere.
So it's not like he's blindly defending Qatar.
No, but he's calling out the hypocrisy of the coverage, the double standards.
And that's consistent with his broader critique of Western media. He's always pushing for fairness, for consistency.
Right. But to really understand this whole issue of media portrayal, we need to look beyond just current events.
What do you mean?
Think about Edward Said's concept of Orientalism, or the work of Jack Shaheen, who documented all those negative Arab stereotypes in Hollywood films. These are deep-rooted issues.
It didn't just appear out of thin air. There's a long, complex history here.
Right. And Hasan argues that there's a deliberate propaganda machine that has been demonizing Muslims and Arabs for decades.
With roots in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Exactly. And this ties directly into the whole debate about free speech and cancel culture.
Oh, yeah. Hasan has a lot to say about that, especially after the backlash he faced for his views on Palestine.
You know, it's interesting. He was hired by MSNBC despite those views being known.
Right. So what changed? Was it a shift in the political climate? Were there behind-the-scenes pressures?
It raises questions about the limits of free speech, especially for those who challenge powerful narratives.
And ultimately, it led him to launch Zeteo.
His own independent media company.
Yeah, subscription-based, free from corporate influence, free from those advertisers.
It's a bold move. He's essentially saying, if I can't speak freely within the existing system, I'll create my own.
And it goes back to his point about power dynamics. He said, you can insult the Prophet Muhammad, but don't insult Elon Musk or Donald Trump.
It's a provocative statement.
Yeah.
But it exposes the double standards, right?
Definitely. And it forces us to think about what we're willing to tolerate, what we're willing to challenge.
How power and money influence what's considered acceptable discourse.
Exactly. So it's not just about what you can say, it's about what you're allowed to say without facing consequences.
Which brings us back to that whole question of navigating trade-offs in media. You know, is it possible to be part of the mainstream without compromising your values?
Right. And how do you reach a broader audience without watering down your message?
It's a delicate balance. And Hasan seems to think it's possible. He doesn't see pragmatism as selling out.
Yeah, like his appearances on shows with hosts he disagrees with, like Piers Morgan.
Right. It's about engaging with those who hold opposing views, trying to bridge divides.
And stepping outside those comfortable echo chambers we all tend to inhabit.
Exactly. Which leads us to another key area of Hasan's work, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
A subject he's been particularly vocal about, and he believes the narrative is starting to shift.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he sees the pro-Israel perspective as losing ground, especially after the events in Gaza. He points to the global condemnation of Israel's actions as evidence of this change.
Interesting. And he's been pretty critical of Israel's actions.
No, absolutely. Remember that debate he had with an Israeli colonel on CNN?
Yeah, he challenged the colonel to explain why so many international human rights organizations were condemning Israel.
Right. If the Israeli narrative was accurate, why the widespread condemnation?
It's classic Hasan, isn't it? Pointing out those inconsistencies, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths.
Exactly. And he does it with such conviction, such passion. You can tell this is an issue he cares deeply about.
And it ties back into his criticisms of media bias, of the ways certain narratives are privileged over others.
Definitely. And it also connects to his concerns about the rise of Donald Trump and the potential consequences of his policies.
You're talking about those comments Trump made about clearing out Gaza.
Yeah, that language was chilling. Echoes of ethnic cleansing.
And Hasan was quick to call it out. He even compared it to how the West would react if Putin made similar statements about Ukrainians.
It's a powerful point. It exposes the double standards, the hypocrisy.
And Hasan believes that Trump's policies, his cabinet appointments, are detrimental to the Middle East.
You know, those appointments, people like Mike Pence as ambassador to Israel, Elise Stefanik, Peter Hecht, all known for their hawkish stances, it's a worrying combination.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of understanding these broader geopolitical trends.
Right. How the rise of right-wing populism is impacting not just the U.S., but the entire world.
And Hasan's platform, Zeteo, is his attempt to provide a counter-narrative to those dangerous trends.
Yeah, he envisions it as a space for truth-telling, for high-quality journalism, free from corporate influence.
And it's all built on a subscription model, people paying directly for the content they believe in.
So it's not just about challenging narratives, it's about creating a sustainable alternative.
Exactly. And it speaks to the power of independent media to offer those diverse perspectives, to hold power accountable.
It's a model that's worth paying attention to, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it's just one part of the larger story of Mehdi Hasan, a journalist who's not afraid to speak his mind, challenge the status quo, and fight for what he believes in.
It's inspiring, to be honest.
Yeah, it is.
It's a big risk building a media company like this, right? I mean, relying entirely on subscribers, no ads, no corporate sponsors.
It is. It is. Especially when you consider how outspoken he is, how polarizing some of his views can be.
Yeah, not exactly the kind of guy big corporations are lining up to sponsor.
Right, right. But he's basically betting that people are tired of the same old, that they're hungry for something different, for journalism that's not beholden to those corporate interests.
And it seems like he might be onto something.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. His following is pretty substantial on Substack, on YouTube, and he keeps attracting some pretty high-profile guests to his show.
Yeah, it shows that you don't have to compromise your values to be successful.
Exactly.
It's more than just a platform, though, right?
Yeah, what do you mean?
It's about building a community,
right?
A movement, like he says, a collective effort to change things.
Right, and he's very conscious of not just preaching to the choir,
Yeah, that's a good point.
He's not just trying to reach people who already agree with him. He wants to engage with those who hold opposing views, even if it means going on shows where he knows he'll face a hostile audience.
It's about bridging those divides, right?
Mm-hmm.
Getting people to actually talk to each other.
Exactly. And it's where those debating skills come in handy. It's not just about scoring points.
No, it's about exposing those flaws in logic, the inconsistencies in those narratives.
And encouraging people to actually think critically for themselves.
And he does it all with that wit, that humor.
Yeah.
That little bit of sarcasm. It can be polarizing, sure.
Definitely.
And it's also incredibly effective.
It's like he's saying, look, I'm not afraid to tell it like I see it, even if it makes you uncomfortable. And I think that's what people find so compelling.
Yeah. Now, going back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, he hasn't held back in his criticism of Israel, even using the term genocide to describe what's happening in Gaza.
That's a loaded term.
It is.
Sure, to spark some debate. But I think it's important to understand the context in which he uses that term.
Right.
He's not just throwing around for shock value. He's making a deliberate argument, one that's based on the evidence he's seen, the historical context, his understanding of the situation.
And he's not alone in that assessment, right? I mean, plenty of human rights organizations, legal scholars, activists have also raised concerns about the severity of the situation.
Absolutely. This isn't just Hasan's opinion.
Right.
It's a complex issue, and it requires careful consideration and nuanced analysis. But I think Hasan's perspective, even if you don't agree with everything he says, is essential to that conversation.
Yeah, his lived experience, growing up as a minority, facing prejudice, understanding what it means to be marginalized, it adds a certain weight to his analysis.
Absolutely. And it's that combination of intellectual rigor and personal conviction that makes him such a powerful voice.
Speaking of personal conviction, he's been very outspoken about free speech, especially the hypocrisy of cancel culture.
Yeah, especially as it relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right. He argues that Palestinians and their supporters are often silenced or marginalized, even in supposedly liberal spaces.
Academics being fired, politicians being targeted, celebrities facing backlash, all for simply expressing support for Palestine.
It's a disturbing trend.
Raises serious questions about the limits of free speech in the West. Who gets to decide what's acceptable discourse?
Yeah. Whose voices are we willing to hear? And whose voices are we quick to silence?
It makes you think.
Hasan's experience at MSNBC is a case in point. They hired him, knowing his views on Palestine, but then he faced that internal pressure, and eventually he left the network.
It suggests that even within mainstream media, there are those invisible boundaries, right?
Unspoken rules about what you can and can't say.
And those boundaries are often reinforced by those powerful institutions, the political agendas, the financial interests. It all creates a system that benefits certain narratives while silencing others.
Right, which is why Hasan created Zeteo, to have that space where he could speak freely without fear of censorship.
That's a bold move.
It is. A reminder that the fight for free speech is ongoing. It's not just about protecting our own right to speak. It's about ensuring that marginalized voices are heard, that a diversity of perspectives is represented.
Now, let's talk about Donald Trump. Hasan's been incredibly critical of Trump's policies, his rhetoric, particularly as it relates to the Middle East.
He sees Trump as a legitimate threat to stability in the region.
And those comments about clearing out Gaza, they were truly alarming.
Hasan went so far as to call it ethnic cleansing.
I don't think that's an overstatement.
I don't either. The language he used, the historical context, the potential implications, it's all incredibly troubling. And Hassan is right to point out that double standard. Imagine if the leader like Putin said something similar about Ukrainians.
The world would be up in arms.
Right. And Hassan connects those comments about Gaza to Trump's broader policies in the Middle East. Policies that he sees as driven by a combination of ignorance, arrogance, and a blatant disregard for human rights.
He points to those cabinet appointments, the close ties to those right-wing figures, his unpredictable behavior on the world stage as evidence of a dangerous approach to foreign policy.
It's scary to think about the potential consequences, especially in a region as volatile as the Middle East.
Absolutely. And in this context, Hassan's work, his platform, his voice become all the more crucial. He's trying to offer that counter-narrative to expose the hypocrisy and the dangers of Trump's policies.
He's not just criticizing, he's offering an alternative vision, one based on diplomacy, respect for human rights, and a genuine commitment to peace.
And I think that's what we desperately need in a world that's becoming increasingly divided and polarized.
I agree. Hassan is always pushing us to think critically, to question those narratives that are often presented as fact, and to consider different perspectives.
And I think that's something he's been doing his entire career.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that makes him so effective as a debater, as an interviewer, is that he really understands his opponent's position. He doesn't just come to a debate with his own talking points.
Right. He meticulously researches his opponent's arguments, he anticipates their rebuttals, and he comes prepared with the evidence to counter them.
It's like he's playing chess, always thinking a few moves ahead.
Absolutely. It's that strategic approach that makes him so effective. And he's not afraid of those tough interviews. He's willing to push powerful figures, ask the hard questions, even if it makes them uncomfortable.
Because that's what good journalism is about, right?
It's about holding people accountable, no matter their position or power. And Hassan doesn't shy away from that responsibility.
And then there's his perspective on the Western media's portrayal of Arabs and Muslims.
He's been incredibly critical of the stereotypes, the double standards, the overall bias he sees.
Oh, yeah. And the Ukraine war provided such a clear example of that. The stark contrast in how Ukrainian refugees were treated compared to Syrian refugees was impossible to ignore.
The language used to describe Ukrainian refugees, it was often dehumanizing. Civilized European people with blue eyes. These were descriptions that were rarely, if ever, used to describe refugees from the Middle East or North Africa.
And Hassan argues that this bias isn't accidental. He sees it as a deliberate propaganda machine that has been demonizing Muslims and Arabs for decades, often with roots in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And he's not afraid to call out the hypocrisy, the double standards, the outright lies he sees being perpetuated.
It's powerful stuff. He's a voice for the voiceless, a champion for those who are often marginalized and misrepresented.
And that brings us back to the issue of free speech and cancel culture, doesn't it? Hassan's personally experienced what it's like to be silenced, to be marginalized for challenging those powerful narratives. He's been very critical of what he sees as a double standard in how cancel culture is applied.
Right.
Academics being fired, politicians being targeted, celebrities being attacked, simply for expressing support for Palestine. But those who espouse harmful views against Muslims or Arabs often face little to no consequences.
It's that question again. Whose voices are we willing to hear? And whose voices are we quick to silence?
Hassan's experience at MSNBC is a perfect example. They hired him knowing his views on Palestine, but then he faced that internal pressure and eventually left.
It suggests that even within mainstream media, there are those invisible boundaries.
Unspoken rules about what's acceptable discourse.
And those boundaries are often reinforced by those powerful institutions, the political agendas, the financial interests.
It creates a system where certain narratives are privileged while others are silenced or marginalized.
Exactly. And Hassan's response to that was to create his own platform, Zeteo, a space where he can speak freely without those constraints.
It's a bold experiment.
It is. It really demonstrates the power of independent media to challenge the status quo and provide that platform for diverse voices.
And it's not just about providing information, it's about building a community. It's about fostering dialogue and empowering people to think critically about the world around them.
Which brings us back to that broader point, right? If we're truly committed to free speech, if we value those diverse perspectives, then we need to be willing to engage with those who hold views that challenge us, even if those views make us uncomfortable.
And Hassan is a master of engaging in those uncomfortable conversations. He doesn't shy away from debate. He seeks it out.
And he does it with that wit, that intelligence, and that deep commitment to truth and justice.
It's inspiring.
It is. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Hasan's approach to interviewing.
Okay.
He's known for being tough but fair, asking those difficult questions, not letting his guests get away with evasions or half-truths.
He does his homework. He anticipates his guests' responses, and he's not afraid to interrupt when they're trying to dodge a question or change the subject.
And he's a master of the follow-up question.
Always pushing for clarity, for specifics, for accountability.
He sees his role as a journalist as being that truth seeker, a watchdog, a voice for the voiceless.
And he takes that responsibility very seriously.
He's not afraid to make people uncomfortable, to hold those in power accountable, and that's part of what makes him such a compelling figure.
Now let's talk about his perspective on the media landscape, specifically the challenges and opportunities facing independent journalism in the digital age.
Yeah, he's been pretty critical of the corporate influence over mainstream media.
He argues that it leads to a narrowing of perspectives, a silencing of dissent.
It's all about profit over truth, right?
Yeah.
And he believes that independent journalism is crucial.
To challenge those dominant narratives, to hold power accountable.
And he's not just talking about it, he's actually doing something about it.
Yeah, his decision to launch Zeteo, an independent media company that's entirely subscriber-funded, free from corporate influence, free from advertiser influence.
Just a bold move.
It is, and it's being watched closely by a lot of people.
It's a potential model for how journalism can thrive in the digital age, right?
Yeah, without being beholden to corporate interests or those political agendas.
Exactly. And it's not just about giving Hasan a platform. It's about creating that space for diverse voices, for those who are often marginalized or silenced by mainstream media.
He envisions Zeteo as a community, a movement.
Yeah, of people who are seeking out a different kind of media, more transparent, more accountable, more responsive to their needs.
It's a pretty inspiring vision. It speaks to that growing desire for a more democratic and participatory media landscape,
where the power to shape the narrative isn't solely in the hands of those with wealth and influence.
Now let's talk about social media and how it shapes our discourse.
Yeah, Hasan has been both a critic and a beneficiary of social media. He recognizes its power, but he also has concerns.
Especially about those algorithms.
Right. He argues that they create these echo chambers, these filter bubbles, where we're only exposed to information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Which can lead to further polarization and division.
Absolutely. And he's concerned about the lack of accountability and transparency from those social media companies.
Yeah, how they collect data, how they moderate content, how those algorithms actually work.
It's a black box in a lot of ways.
But Hasan believes that social media can be a force for good
if it's used responsibly, ethically.
And he encourages people to be more media literate, to be more critical of the information they consume online.
Yeah, to seek out diverse perspectives, to engage in respectful dialogue.
And he's not just preaching, he models those values on his own platforms.
Exactly. Now, what about the future of journalism? He sees it as being in a state of flux, right? Traditional media struggling to adapt, independent journalism gaining momentum.
He sees the rise of independent media as a positive development.
It's an opportunity to challenge those narratives, to provide alternative perspectives, to hold power accountable.
But he also acknowledges the challenges, right?
Oh, absolutely. The financial pressures, the lack of institutional support, that constant battle against misinformation.
Which spreads so easily online.
Right. And so Hasan thinks the future of journalism depends on a combination of factors: innovation, collaboration, that strong commitment to ethical principles.
He calls for greater transparency, more diversity in newsrooms, a renewed focus on investigative journalism.
And he's not waiting for someone else to make those changes.
Nope, he's taking action.
Building his own platform, inspiring a new generation of journalists to embrace that independent, ethical, impactful storytelling.
It's quite a journey, isn't it?
It is.
From those early days in Swindon to launching his own media company.
To challenging presidents and prime ministers. To taking on the entire media establishment. He's a force to be reckoned with, that's for sure.
I think so, too. And what's most impressive is that he's done it all on his own terms. He hasn't compromised his values. He hasn't backed down from a fight.
And he's certainly given us all a lot to think about.
He has.
About the role of media, about free speech, about the responsibility we all have to speak truth to power.
And to challenge those narratives that we know are wrong, no matter how uncomfortable it might be.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Mehdi Hasan, we want to leave you with that same question he always asks. What truths do you feel need to be spoken more loudly in today's world?
What makes you uncomfortable? What stories are being ignored? What narratives need to be challenged?
Hasan has shown us that it's not always easy, but it's necessary.
The truth, no matter how uncomfortable, needs to be spoken. And sometimes, speaking that truth requires us to step outside our comfort zones, to engage with those who hold views that challenge us, and to have those difficult conversations. Conversations that can lead to a deeper understanding, and ultimately, to a better world.
We hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of Mehdi Hasan, his work, his ideas, and maybe it's even inspired you to be a little more courageous in your own life, to speak your truth, and to challenge those narratives that you know are wrong. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep searching for the truth, and keep speaking your mind. Thanks for joining us. We've covered a lot about Hasan, his background, his style, his views. But what ties it all together?
I'd say it's his commitment to challenging the status quo. You see it throughout his entire career, from his early days as a journalist all the way to heading up Zeteo.
Yeah, he's never been afraid to ruffle feathers, to make people uncomfortable, to point out those injustices. And I think his background played a part in that, growing up as a minority.
Definitely. Those early experiences, seeing the world through a different lens, probably made him more aware how media portrays different groups.
Right, it's not just theoretical for him, it's personal.
Exactly.
Like with his criticism of Western media's coverage of Ukraine, the difference in how Ukrainian refugees and Syrian refugees were treated, it was eye-opening.
It was, yeah. Exposed a deep bias that a lot of people just don't see.
And Hasan doesn't just point it out, he names names.
Yeah.
Calls out those powerful groups. Pro-Israel lobbies, Islamophobia, anti-Arab sentiment. He holds them accountable.
Even when it makes him a target.
And that takes guts. It's much easier to just go with the flow. Stay in your echo chamber where everyone agrees.
Right. It's comfortable there.
But Hasan disrupts that, makes people confront those uncomfortable truths.
Like launching Zeteo, he could have stayed in mainstream media, but he chose to create his own thing.
His own space, free from corporate influence, from advertisers.
Yeah, pretty bold move.
Shows how much he believes in independent journalism. To challenge the system, to platform those marginalized voices.
And it's more than just giving a platform to his own views.
Right.
He wants Zeteo to be a community, a movement even.
Yeah, a place for people who want something different. More transparency, more accountability, media that actually listens.
That's a powerful idea.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Mehdi Hasan, we want to leave you with a question he often asks.
Okay.
What truths need to be spoken more loudly today? What makes you uncomfortable? What stories are we missing? What narratives need to be challenged?
Hasan has shown us that it's not easy to challenge the status quo, but it is necessary. He reminds us that speaking truth to power is essential, even when it's hard.
Even when it's uncomfortable. Sometimes speaking that truth means stepping outside our comfort zones, engaging with people who disagree with us.
Having those tough conversations that can lead to better understanding, to a better world. We hope this deep dive gave you a better understanding of Mehdi Hasan, his work, his ideas, maybe even inspired you to be a bit braver, to speak your truth.
To challenge those narratives you know are wrong.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep searching for the truth, and keep speaking your mind.
Thanks for joining us.